Variable scoping defines the bounds of when a variable comes into existence and when it will no longer be accessible. For example, if we create a variable inside of an if statement, the variable will only be scoped to that if statement and no longer exist after the if statement. To demonstrate this, we'll create an if statement, and for the condition we'll just say true to guarantee that this if statement always executes. And inside of the if statement, we'll say const a equals 5. Inside of the if statement, we'll console.log a. And then outside of the if statement, we'll try to say console.log a. Now we'll notice inside of VS Code, it's actually telling me cannot find a. So we don't really even need to run this to confirm, but let's see what happens if we do try to run it. When we run it, we get this error that says cannot find a, the same error we were seeing inside of VS Code. This is because we declared a inside of our if statement, which means it came into existence on this line, and when the if statement was done, our variable ceased to exist. We can remove this console log just to confirm the rest of our code is working. A fast way to do this would be to select the line and then control / to automatically comment it out. And then we can run this code again and verify that everything does work, and it's really just this one line where we tried to access the variable outside the bounds of its scope that was breaking our code. Back when we first introduced variables, we mentioned that we could declare variables with let, const, and var. We mentioned not to use var, and the reason being is that var does not observe the same scopes as let and const. If we change this variable to be var instead, and we put our console log back in, our code will actually run in this scenario as var does not observe the same block scoping. This would be considered abnormal behavior and can lead to confusion within your code. For this reason, you should never use var. There are 3 scopes that I want to cover. The first is going to be module scope. So we'll create a variable called module scope equals hello. And module scope is basically the scope of the file. Each file is known as a module. So if we create this variable outside of any other code block, this variable will exist for the entirety of this file. Any if statements, any functions, any for loops within this file after the variable's been declared can access the variable. Next, we have function scope. We'll create a function. We'll just call it some function. And inside of here, we'll have a param1 and the function code block. Function scope will define 2 things. The parameters for the function will be scoped to each individual execution of that function. So if we invoke this function 5 different times, each time we invoke it, we'll create a different copy of this param1 variable, which is scoped to that specific execution of the function. Now, in addition to that, any variables we create inside of the function will also be scoped to that function's invocation. So we can create another variable inside of here. We'll say const function scoped equals function scoped variable. And then inside of there, we'll also move our if statement where we have our block scope variable. We'll change this to be const block scoped equals block scope variable. And then we'll change our console log to be block scoped. And then we'll also delete the console log down here as we no longer need it. So in this code, we now have variables observing 3 different scopes. The variable module scoped will be accessible throughout the entire file after it. So inside of here, if we wanted to say console.log module scope, this is perfectly fine, and we can run this code. And then we have param1, which will be scoped to the function, and each invocation of the function will get its own copy of this variable. So if we tried to use this variable outside of the function, right here, we wouldn't be able to. You can even see in VS Code that it just says cannot find name param1 because at this line of code, there exists no variable called param1. However, any nested blocks within this function could access this variable. So if we were trying to access param1 on this line, we can see that IntelliSense is already giving me suggestions to show that it's available, and we can access this variable. Now, the other function scope variable we have is this variable declared inside of the function block outside of any other blocks within that function. And lastly, we have our block scope variable, which will only exist for the scope of this if statement. And to reiterate, if we were to use var instead of const, this variable would actually be scoped to the function, not the block, and let and const will actually observe the block scope, which once again is why you should always use let and const and never use var.